Citizen Kane is a film many scholars will tell you is the greatest of all time. And some of them have even seen it, so they must mean business. It was genuinely quite revolutionary. It's credited with inventing, or at least popularizing, many cinematic techniques that are still used today, including the jump scare.
Everybody remembers that one scene where you suddenly cut to a cockatoo screeching just before...
That was to wake up the audience.
It's as
That's
simple
the
as that.
entire significance of the cockatoo.
And a lot of it really holds up. What's weird is you expect it to be a stuffy old thing, vintage and prestigious and made for the amusement of old-timey people who don't think like we do today. But it can get properly funny and energetic at times. Hot take, just putting this out there. Citizen Kane? It's a pretty good movie. It was the feature film debut of writer, director, and wine salesman Orson Welles. Even while it was being made, Kane was something of a rarity. Despite being made by a first-time director, the production company he was under contract with, RKO Pictures, the studio famously behind King Kong and Citizen Kane, had given Welles final cut privilege. This is a movie term referring to who gets final say over the film that actually gets sent to theaters. This is a level of artistic control not normally given to first-time directors. If a director doesn't have this privilege, the executives and producers at the company often make their own changes for commercial, personal, or other reasons, and can override the creator's wishes for their work. Welles used Final Cut to make a film seen by many nerd betas as the greatest ever. When Welles' next film with the same studio, The Magnificent Ambersons, had mixed test screenings, Welles made small changes but remained confident the work was good and would be received better on a full release. However, RKO felt otherwise, and due to various contract negotiations, Welles had given up Final Cut privileges. While Welles was working on another film in Brazil, RKO made extensive edits to the film, including reshooting the ending to be completely different, and cut 40 minutes out. In Welles' own words,
"What's left is only the first 6 reels. My whole third act is lost because of all of the hysterical tinkering that went on."
And it was genuinely lost too. To save space in the film archives, the removed segments of the film were destroyed. The creator's ideal version of The Magnificent Ambersons is gone forever. The released version of Ambersons is regarded, by all 4 people who've seen it, as one of the best films ever, and perhaps even better than Citizen Kane. But that only makes the whole thing more horrible. We can only imagine what it could have been. This was the beginning of Welles' long fight for creative control over his projects, a fight he seemed to lose most of the time. Welles went on to make lots of other films during his career, and some of them are still really good. But in many ways, a lot of them were never truly his. Welles was open about things he wished he'd done differently, or more ideal versions of his films. He even considered doing a new ending of Magnificent Ambersons 30 years later with the surviving actors. But these truer versions of his films never surfaced. Welles, I argue, was ahead of his time here. What he was yearning to do was make director's cuts. In the modern era, the idea that a film will get a director's cut is almost taken for granted. In fact, it's so widely accepted that the director's cut is the most authentic version of a film that some fans of the DC superhero movies are asking specifically for a Snyder cut of Justice League, under the impression that this would inherently be the better version of the film than the version that some other later director would have made. Tens of thousands of dollars have been raised for charities in the process of fans demonstrating their desire to Warner Brothers. Now, I quite like a lot of Zack Snyder's films myself. The first step is admitting I have a problem, and I'd love to see his version of Justice League, and also unsee the version that Joss Whedon witty dialogued himself all over. But I can't help but notice that we seem to now be living in an age where you can't just dislike a film and move on with your life. It's an opportunity to become even more engaged, to give even more of your time to something you didn't even like, in the hopes of getting a newer, better version. So, how did we get here? And are director's cuts all that different that much of the time, or isn't it somewhat bizarre to expect a director to relive a finished work in order to make a slightly better version of something that was already completed and released? And is a director really the main authority on the most ideal version of a work? Let's look at some examples of director's cuts and how they're different from the originals, and if they're actually that much better. And just generally go on an adventure of discovery for what all this means for how we think about art in the modern era. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Welcome back to Scanline. Put succinctly, A director's cut is
a version of a motion picture that is edited according to the director's wishes, and that usually includes scenes cut from the version created for general distribution.
Wikipedia says Blade Runner was the first film to ever use the phrasing director's cut in marketing, but the page doesn't actually cite a source to confirm this. So, thanks Wikipedia, excellent work there. As the questions of creative control grow increasingly culturally pertinent and profitable, it's become more and more common for films to have a second release as a new, alternative version, one more in line with the director's original wishes, a sort of final cut privilege in retrospect. A shocking amount of films have director's cuts now, which gives the impression they serve a creative need that goes unsatisfied in the original process. But creative control is more of a vague, conceptual idea than a thing whose effects are truly measurable. Let's look at some tangible examples of differences between cuts and why they can be important. We might as well start with Blade Runner, since it apparently started all this. Cite your sources, god damn it! Ridley Scott's 1982 sci-fi dystopian speculative fiction science fiction film Blade Runner. Everyone knows what Blade Runner is, why am I explaining? Blade Runner's a very good movie. I think. I've heard it's good. I've got a copy here in my editing program and I'm skipping through it looking for footage to use and wow, it seems great. It's got flying cars and a cool gun, explores complex questions about personhood and what it even means to be human. It's got music that's good. There's some eyes in it. And some eyes here and here. And this guy loves talking about seeing things with his eyes. And then later he tells this guy about all the stuff he's seen. If I didn't know any better, I'd say there's some kind of theme going on here. Foolish Ridley, don't you know themes are for book reports? Get all these images and ideas out of here before you poke someone's eye out. Oh no, I'm doing it! The movie had mixed reception upon its release. To quote Brian J. Robb's guide to Ridley Scott, critical reaction was decidedly mixed. The New York Times called it
muddled yet mesmerizing.
Time magazine said the film,
like its setting, is a beautiful, deadly organism that devours life.
And the Los Angeles Times complained, Blade Crawler might be more like it. Got him! Fuck him up, Sheila! The film, while good, had some confusing choices and strange problems. There's a lot of beautifully subtle storytelling and world building where the viewer is given the chance to think for themselves and pick up on what's happening by paying attention.
You know the score, pal. You're not cops, you're little people.
And yet there's this terrible voiceover.
And I'd rather be a killer than a victim. And that's exactly what Bryant's threat about little people meant.
The voiceover explains away everything even remotely subtle, and it sounds like Harrison Ford is bored out of his mind. There's a lot of really beautiful storytelling, like when Deckard retires a female replicant and, looking at her body, feels genuinely awful about what he's done. The audience can see plainly what hunting down creatures who are effectively human and have done nothing wrong except want to live longer has done to him. But then the voiceover comes in just to make sure you know that's happening, just in case you don't like being trusted to think.
The report would be routine retirement of a replicant, which didn't make me feel any better about shooting a woman in the back.
Oh, Deckard feels sympathy? I wouldn't have known. It's not like there's an actor in the frame showing me or anything. By far the worst one is legendary. We get this incredible moment of humanity from Roy Batty, theoretically the antagonist of the movie, as his lifespan runs out and he talks about the beauty of all the things he's seen. It's one of the greatest moments in film history. But hey, guess what decides to ruin it?
I don't know why he saved my life. Maybe in those last moments he loved life more than he ever had before.
Oh, I think that guy liked being alive. Deckard and Rachel prepare to escape together, and in a very tense moment, Deckard finds proof Gaff has been in his apartment. A calling card of his is left in there. Then they leave and it's incredibly tense and suspenseful as the doors close. And then, suddenly, after all this noirish tension and dystopian storytelling and eternal night and rain and neon, BAM! Upbeat music, bright skies, clean air. Deckard and Rachel are taking a nice drive in the woods, and that crappy voiceover tells us actually Rachel was a special replicant who doesn't have a built-in death date.
Tyrell had told me Rachel was special. No termination date.
Oh sure, yeah, this ending doesn't feel weird at all. In the last 30 seconds of the film, it all turned out to be okay. Just a complete whiplash. And why is that unicorn there? So it was fine, really good even, but clearly flawed. Soon after its release, there was speculation that the studio had meddled with production. I mean, that ending is literally just B-roll borrowed from The Shining. A so-called work print of the film, a not entirely finished version made during the editing process, had been shown to test audiences and was speculated to have been significantly different and then edited down. And in the early 90s, it started being shown in a limited theatrical run, branded as a director's cut, though Scott had no actual say in this version's release either and publicly disowned this version. The work print wasn't a finished version of the film. For example, it was missing the horrendous voiceover, which is obviously a positive thing to miss. There are no closing credits and it just ends on the words, "The End." But more importantly, it doesn't the end with a horrible story-ruining tacked-on happy ending. It ends in the elevator with Deckard and Rachel, with all the horrible feelings of uncertainty and doom that come with not knowing what happens next, and that Rachel probably doesn't have long to live even if Gaff spared her. The unicorn thing is still weird though. I guess Gaff is just a quirky guy who likes to spare people and do origami. To be fair, I'm a pretty big fan of sparing people. I even showed Kurt mercy, even though he showed me no gratitude for it. The work print was surprisingly popular, and the differences were lauded as positive ones. This caused Warner Brothers to begin work on a proper director's cut. Well, not actually a director's cut. Someone else was put in charge of doing it, and Scott just got to provide notes and consult on it. Warner Brothers seemed to be banking on the idea of releasing a director's cut, and all the ideas of creative freedom that implied to fans and film buffs, but not in actually giving the actual director that actual freedom. The director's cut is so much better than the original. When trying to explain what the differences actually are, there aren't exactly that many major changes if you just list them out. Largely it's about what's not there anymore. There's no voiceovers whatsoever and the happy ending has been removed. It's amazing what big a difference the lack of voiceover has though. It lets all the actors and performances breathe. Instead of being told what to think about something, they're simply being shown it and expected to think for themselves. And that's really powerful. Hey, Shannon.
Yeah?
Okay, when you're editing this bit, I want it to slowly digitally zoom on my face while I get emotional about how good Blade Runner is. And, you know, we can play like some knockoff Tears in Rain music. We can get Zoe Blade to do it. It'll be great. It'll be a really funny reference.
Harris, I don't think that works in a video essay.
Yeah, but I want it, and I'm the director.
Yeah, well, I'm doing a lot of the editing, and I might not edit it like that. Maybe in the final cut of this video, 20 years later, you can finally achieve your dumb vision.
Oh, I get it. That's very meta.
And I mean, honestly, like speaking as your co-writer, the parts of the video that you wrote are full of holes in your research. Like, the cockatoo scene in Citizen Kane isn't the first jump scare. It was most likely popularized by cat people in 1942 with the Luton bus. There's a scene with a bus. It's the first ever, like, well-known jump scare.
Yeah, but it's a funny joke, isn't it? And we get to explain the cockatoo, and that's pretty good. It's a very light-hearted opening. It doesn't have to be completely true. Oh, now I'm explaining my joke. I spent ages convincing myself that bit was funny. And now it's ruined. By the way, what happened to the footage of me driving to McDonald's for 15 minutes and talking about how much I love tapes for the last video? Did you just take it out? Am I going to have to start a petition to release the Harris cut of the VHS episode of Scanline? Is that really going to have to happen now?
You know what? Forget it. I'm cutting this whole part out. It interrupts your explanation of the director's cut, and honestly, it's a little bit indulgent.
What? No! You can't do that! My overly indulgent director's intent is being violated! You can't just... But most importantly, and I can't stress enough how cool a change this is, midway through the movie, while Deckard plays idly on his piano, he begins to have a dream. And he dreams about a unicorn. Holy shit. I mean, holy shit! What a small, simple change, and yet the difference is amazing. I mean, firstly, finally someone in the movie based on the book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep has someone having a dream in it, but more importantly, now the origami unicorn Gaff leaves behind means something. Because how could Gaff know Deckard's dreams? This implies that maybe Deckard is also a replicant who believes he's human, with implanted dreams and memories. It's still ambiguous, obviously. I mean, maybe Gaff also dreams about unicorns. Humans do, don't they? This ambiguity, to me at least, is the point of the film. Ultimately, it doesn't matter whether Deckard is a replicant, because he would still be equally a person, human in all but name. And it's only in this cut, many years after its release, that this point really gets to be made. And all this stuff is brought up by the simple inclusion of a daydream about a unicorn. It's kind of amazing how much a simple change, just a couple of seconds of new footage, can impact the overall meaning and value of an entire film. I think this, better than anything else in any other film, can demonstrate the sheer power editing can have on a movie. Quoting here from Rob's book again.
10 years later, in 1992, with the release of the director's cut, the film received the welcome it deserved, according to the Washington Post. The film is great on every level. The poignant screenplay about a man's futile quest for immortality, Scott's tremendous direction, the incredible futuristic sets designed by Lawrence G. Paul, Sid Mead, and the others, the phenomenal special effects, and the touching performances, especially from Hauer, a replicant fighting against the ebbing of his life. His swan song is one of the most touching in modern movie history.
Quick aside, maybe people would have been more willing to recognize his performance if there hadn't been a fucking voiceover right after it. What's interesting about this director's cut, though, is that it wasn't actually the director's cut. It's ironic that one of the most famous examples of a director's cut is not actually a director's cut, and studios were already capitalizing on the idea of a director's cut to sell a movie, but we'll get back to that later. 15 years later, there was a final cut of Blade Runner, which was made with Scott finally in complete control. It's essentially a version of the director's cut with slightly different editing, better effects, some changes in color grading. Harrison Ford's son came in to reshoot a few minor things to make mouth movements that fit the ADR. Oh, and most importantly, the shot of the bird flying away at the end finally matches the rest of the fucking scene. It took 25 years, but we did it, everyone. It's not really a necessary version of the film, but it's nice that Scott finally got to make a version he properly had control over. After the success of the director's cut of Blade Runner, director's cuts became increasingly common. The most famous other example of this is also by Ridley Scott. Kingdom of Heaven's original release was very divisive and pretty poorly received overall. Critics and audiences generally found it unsatisfying, often boring and lacking in depth. It was so bad that Roger Ebert, a film critic from opposite land who says the wrong thing almost all the time because he's a hack, gave it 3.5 stars out of 4 and said it was better than Gladiator. 3.5 stars? I'm not saying Roger Ebert's taste is questionable, but just putting it out there, that's the rating he gave to The Phantom Menace. Okay, actually, I take it back, Roger Ebert's great. People are really uncharitable to The Phantom Menace. It's actually pretty good. Kingdom of Heaven then got a director's cut released on DVD with 45 minutes of new material, which massively expands the story, alters the roles of the main characters, and turns the film into a genuine masterpiece of historical epicness, and fleshes out Orlando Bloom's role so much that it transforms into his best ever performance, and also, frankly, his only performance. There are hundreds of director's cuts now, many of which arguably improve the movie. Most of them have much less drastic changes than these, but it's clear that even small changes can make a big difference, and as with the final cut, even if there's next to no difference, the point is the creator getting to achieve their vision unsullied by previous meddling. That is the point, right? Isn't it? Well, not all alternative cuts of films exist for this reason. Artistic intent and creative ambition aren't set in stone. Okay, time to get personal. As a creator who's got a lot of stuff out there that he can't meaningfully go back and change without releasing it as a whole new thing, there are tons of things that I would do differently now in retrospect, or mistakes that I genuinely would love to go back and fix. When I make YouTube videos for my own personal channel, I inherently have Final Cut privilege. No one can tell me what to do, there is no executive producer with any oversight or control, and when I work with a sponsor, I tell them I'm not going to make any changes even if they ask, and they just are going to have to live with what I make. So, basically, I am at all times free to unleash my unmitigated creative vision upon the world. But what if my unmitigated creative vision isn't perfect the first time around? What if I make genuine mistakes, or change my mind, or couldn't afford to do something, or just didn't have the talent to creative the things I visioned? That's got to be pretty mitigating right there. Most of the time, director's cuts for me would be things like re-recording voiceover to sound a bit less echoey or a bit less mouth-clicky. That sound. I hate when I hear myself making that sound, it's awful. Or remove jokes that I realise weren't actually very funny in retrospect, or worse, are actually casually ableist and I just hadn't noticed. Or fix that time I accidentally left an arrow at 2% opacity at the top of the screen by accident instead of fully fading it out and it's there for half the fucking video! So getting another run at a project isn't always fully about control. It's about making improvements that you feel you could do now. and a lot of director's cuts are more in line with this way of thinking. One director is famous for changing his mind about something after releasing a film that he thought was fine at the time, and that director's name is Paul Thomas Anderson. When Magnolia came out, it was well received, but considered by some to be a little on the long side. Anderson defended the decisions he made for his film and seemed pretty happy with it.
And I was really upfront, saying it's going to be 3 hours. And, they were wonderful in saying, okay, we're not going to tell you what to do. We'd love it if this was shorter, but so just make it as short as you can.
Okay. But the interesting thing about time is, it makes you rethink your work a little sometimes.
This movie at this moment, the one that is in the theaters today,
yeah,
it's the movie you wanted to make.
Exactly.
Is it the movie you set out to make?
Exactly.
But if you were given the opportunity to do another cut of it...
Oh, I'd slice that thing down. I'd cut it's way too fucking long.
Good.
Oh, no, it's unmerciful how long it is.
No director's cut of Magnolia has been released, but it's useful knowing directors might have made their own films differently with the benefit of hindsight, even when they defended them at the time. Sam Raimi had complete control over Evil Dead, his first film, to the point he places the failure of his next film, Crime Wave, on there being too much oversight compared to Evil Dead.
They replaced my actors, they threw Bruce Campbell out of the lead, they threw out my musician Joe LaDuca, they recut the picture, they had their own say with the sound effects and mix, they did everything they could to make it what it is today.
Did you see Crime Wave?
Yeah.
I saw that movie on an airplane and people still walked out.
ED was independently financed, largely by whoever Raimi and his friends could get to give them money, so they could do whatever they wanted.
We didn't have nearly the freedom as our first film because investors aren't going to come on the set. A dentist isn't going to say, are you sure that camera angle's right?
But this freedom doesn't mean Raimi was necessarily going to be happy forever with all aspects of the film he made. There's a controversial segment in the film where a woman is sexually assaulted by demonic trees. The scene is far more gruesome than anything else in the film, and it's definitely a contributing factor to it being regarded as one of the video nasties in the UK and getting an NC-17 in the US. Plus it was banned in other countries, with different releases subject to various different cuts over the years. In retrospect, Raimi isn't happy with that scene and talks about this openly.
Well, I think it was unnecessarily gratuitous and a little too brutal, and finally because people were offended in a way that my goal is not to offend people. It is to entertain, thrill, scare, make them laugh, but not to offend them. Regret putting it in? I do.
Piers Haggard felt precisely the same way about his folk horror film The Blood on Satan's Claw.
The rape scene now, I think it's probably too strong. And it's interesting that I wasn't bothered at the time. I think you will find most directors, if they get their teeth into a sequence which is going to be really powerful, they become completely seduced, and I was seduced by the sheer dramatic power.
Directors have these kinds of regrets or change their minds about stuff all the time. Although, of course, no studio has helped them re-release these films with the sexual assaults cut. I guess adding in more unicorns is more important than ameliorating excessive sexual violence on film. Some directors actually do get to make their ideal changes though. The Coen brothers, who did some work on the editing of Evil Dead and later worked closely with Raimi on other projects, got to do a director's cut of Blood Simple, despite also being in charge of the original cut. Blood Simple is awesome. It's very different from the rest of their films, but not tangibly worse, just different. It's a very stripped-down thriller. The director's cut is even more streamlined. It's about 3 minutes shorter. No scenes have been outright cut, but a lot of shots have been trimmed down in length, so the feel is much tighter. These changes are very small. The director's cut is arguably tighter and better edited, but also not different enough that I don't think anyone who didn't like it would like it that much more, and I don't think anyone who really liked the movie thinks that much better of it because of this version either. I'm reminded here of Orson Welles complaining about hysterical tinkering. What exactly was the purpose of all this? The film is theoretically better, but I find it strange that people would go back to create a slightly better version of something that already existed and was fine. Now, I love the Coen brothers as much as the next pretentious white nerd boy, but frankly, if there's any evidence that director's cuts are actually a bad idea, this is Exhibit A. Aren't mistakes something we ought to accept rather than hope to eventually see slightly touched up later? In one of the many documentaries about Blade Runner, one called All Our Variant Futures, a lot of attention is paid to all the mistakes being fixed in the final cut, but a lot is also made of the charm of some of the mistakes, Gaff's eye color changing, things like that. And it's clear a lot of thought went into when one mistake is something to be corrected to improve the quality of the work, and when other mistakes bring their own character to the film and ought to be left alone. Aren't all these mistakes part of the film, though? Should an artist be allowed to perpetually alter their work once it's been handed over to the public? In a 1993 article in the journal Film Comment, film scholar and critic Greg Solman wrote Uncertain Glory, Director's Cut Editions, The Redemption of an Art, or the First Step on a Slippery Slope. He said,
"Viewing film art as perpetually subject to update and correction, political or other, says something about the director's relationship to their work. In a way, they redress artistic grievances by treating movies as mere product. In this country, an inalienable right to change as an artist doesn't extend to changing art and, therefore, art history. Rather than artistic deliverance, the DC trend represents a significant disturbance of film history and, equally important, the popular cultural memory of the original audiences. Even kitsch merits protection. The director's cut means the practical elimination of a film record, and that the market valorizes the new to the point that it supplants the old version. And despite what the misnomer director's cut implies, this movement augurs poorly for the rise of the Hollywood auteur. There's certainly no amelioration of the compromise between strict studio and enterprising director, essential to evaluating their personal commitment to circumvention of studio Philistines. In the end, the same old commerce here masquerades as the aesthetics of creative freedom."
The ending to his piece is appropriately dramatic.
Our film culture faces a future in which old movies will not just seem different from how we remembered them, they will be. The theatrical release is fast becoming a work in progress. Original versions soon will exist only in the fragments of our collective memory. Then, to quote the authority, all those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain.
In a much more recent piece, Alex Rose's Auteurs Gone Wild, Why the Director's Cut Often Turns into an Axe Murder in The American Scholar from 2010, Rose says,
"Directors couldn't leave well enough alone. They redressed their early classics in ever gaudier clothing in attempts to reclaim their youthful eminence, since corrupted by years of compromise."
Rose calls director's cuts an indulgence, saying,
"Even the subtleties, while peripheral and seemingly innocuous, have their effects. An extra cutaway here, a quick reaction shot there, and suddenly the gags aren't quite as funny. The sex scenes aren't as breathless. The fights lose their drive. The dialogue drags. Just a little more padding and primping, and the intangible gestalt of the original is lost. Indulgence is a death sentence. A reliable antidote, however, is the adoption of constraints. In what other medium would colossal vanity be permitted, much less encouraged?"
Solman says,
"Typically, the commercially successful, rather than the artistically worthy, enjoy studio benevolence. Same as it ever was."
In a reader's response section in a film comment from later in the year, Gordon Hale from Philadelphia has a prescient comment on Solman's piece. He describes Tom Richardson re-editing Tom Jones, then says,
"As films grow older and their copyrights expire, both the artists and the moneymen will have the same incentive to prepare new editions qualifying for new copyrights. Original versions will then be withdrawn completely. New, improved editions will abound, just like toothpaste and detergent. And the example Solman cites will seem like a drop in the bucket."
So even though I like Blood Simple, I really quite like that there is a director's cut of Blood Simple. I love the Coen brothers, and I'm glad that they have the power to go back and do that if they want. It still manages to pose a lot of difficult questions about how much power a director should have over their art, and whether or not director's cuts are actually as anti-commercial as they seem to be. Maybe there's a certain confidence or honesty in not going back and making changes. Anderson and Raimi have criticisms of their old films, as anyone who gets years to look back on their work ought to do, but they aren't going back and making changes to things that are already a part of history in order to satisfy those criticisms. It's okay to learn and move on, for things to not be perfect. It may well be that the ability to go back and change something if you want to poses just as much of a threat to the integrity of art as any meddling studio. Sometimes a director's changes don't just not make the film any better, but they actively make it worse. And what director's name springs to mind better than Francis Ford Coppola? Apocalypse Now is a really good film, and it better be because it took forever to make and would have destroyed Coppola's career if it hadn't. But it was good, so it meant Coppola kept his career and was free to go on to make... Apocalypse Now is a really good film, but in a very interesting way. At nearly 2.5 hours, it's pretty long, but the pacing of the movie is so good, all the scenes flow so perfectly, and the dreamlike descent into madness is so well defined that it's pleasant to sit through. You kind of slip into it. It doesn't feel its length at all. If you showed me the movie and told me it was 90 minutes, I would probably believe you. In 2001, Coppola released Apocalypse Now Redux, an extended cut with reworked editing and more scenes added in. This new version is 3 hours and 22 minutes. More content squeezed out of the content tube onto the conveyor belt of cinema? Yes, please. Apocalypse Now? Good film. Great film. Arguably a masterpiece. Apocalypse Now Redux? Garbage! The whole thing is fucking terrible! He ruined it! I hate you so much, Francis! When you shoot over 1 million feet of footage to make your masterpiece, which yeah, I guess is an achievement, it turns out that most of that footage is piss, and you probably shouldn't put all of it in the film. The additional scenes utterly destroy the pacing of the original, so while it's technically only almost an hour longer, it feels 5 hours longer. I've seen the Redux version twice, and both times I had to pause and do something else for a while, like take a nap or watch a different, better film. The long-ass plantation scene adds so little to the film, it effectively takes away from it by distracting from what the film had successfully focused on more by being shorter. Just because some of the stuff in a film is good, doesn't mean you can put an entire kitchen... Oh, fuck! All the tiny scenes of humour or light-hearted escapes from the darkness are washed away by the sheer scope of the thing. It just keeps on going and it's boring and drags to the point of being actively painful. I slapped my meat too hard against the walls of my set. And they're all hurty now. Luckily, since it turns out that director's intent is a super malleable concept, it appears that Coppola has changed his mind yet again about what his film is supposed to be. This year, for the 40th anniversary, he's releasing the Apocalypse Now Final Cut, director's cut number 3 at this point, which is actually 20 minutes shorter than the Redux version. I'm curious if this version of the film manages to maintain the amazing feel of the original, but honestly, I doubt it. Coppola already made a really good version of his film 40 years ago. He had his final cut. Take it away from him now, he's done, it was fine. I haven't seen this version of the film because I don't care. But it is coming to a theatre right next to me in September, so I basically have no choice to eventually see it. And in the director's cut of this video, I will put my impressions of the film here and let you know what I thought of it. And that video will come out in 20 years! Or when I hit 1 million subscribers, whichever comes first. Incidentally, years ago when I was talking to one of my many pretentious film friends who I secretly hate, I studied documentary production at uni. You run into these people, it's an occupational hazard. And I was explaining to her how much I hated Apocalypse Now Redux, but then she asked me, "Have you heard about the work print?" She then went on to explain that there is a leaked work print of the movie, which is 5 hours long. The 10-minute long song, The End by The Doors, plays in its entirety in the opening in this version of the film. What were they thinking? Was the intent to make a film that long at some point? Did they think people would watch it? Were they developing an experimental new torture device? Don't watch it. Even if you can find it leaked online somewhere, just don't watch it. It's not worth stealing. This draft of Apocalypse Now, much like the actual draft, is something that you're morally obliged to dodge. So here's an even more evolved version of the Blood Simple problem. Directors are going back and re-editing their films to try to undo some of the damage they did in the first re-edit. The slippery slope was real, and one of the best directors ever is actively tumbling down it right now, hysterically tinkering with his film again. But there's actually an even more egregious example of a director making a silly edit to their film and everyone wanting the original back. That's right, you all knew it was coming. I'm talking about Steven Spielberg. E.T. the Extraterrestrial is a pretty good movie, but 20 years later Spielberg decided some changes were necessary. The kids in this scene are in way too much danger. Look, some of those cops have guns. Well, now in this version they have walkie-talkies. Phew! Now the kids are never in any danger as they fly hundreds of feet in the air on fucking bicycles. It appears that even Steven has gone on to regret this decision, or at the very least makes sure the original is still available. So this is an example of a director deciding they want something changed, going to great technological lengths to get it changed, and then having second thoughts. This whole directorial freedom to go back and change your films as important thing is starting to look a little bit flimsy in the face of directors making changes that they then decide were bad. There's probably an example of a director being even worse than this, but, oh, whoops, oh look, we're out of time for this episode of Fine. We all want to talk about him. It's time to talk about Federico Fellini. Fine, George Lucas. George Lucas's amazing and revolutionary science fiction film, THX 1138, is an ass-kickingly depressing and bizarre prediction of the future that makes some really incisive comments about modern consumerism. Characters literally buy weird plastic shapes just for the joy of having purchased something, then throw them in the trash. In 1977, George Lucas predicted Funko Pop. The original theatrical version had 5 minutes taken out against Lucas's wishes. After the success of a couple of above-average fantasy films he made a bit later, Lucas got to release a restored version with that footage added back in, which is nice. He got his movie back in line with his vision. But then George started deciding that his films couldn't just be brought into accordance with his original vision. No, they could be retrospectively improved. I'm sure you all know about this already, but in 2004, George Lucas released the director's cut of THX 1138. I'm doing another fake out. This director's cut adds a bunch of CGI and some new shots and effects. It's 2 minutes longer, and it's just kind of needless. It's nice that his film got to be properly mastered and restored, I guess, but the level of meddling with a thing that was really finished decades prior is unnecessary. The film doesn't need some more CGI scenes added in years later. It was already great. If an old thing has flaws or isn't perfect, or you change your mind about it, sometimes it's okay to let it go. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode of George! Mr. Lucas, I love your films. I love you as a person. I love you as a thinker. I think you're an amazing man. And Star Wars is an absolute blessing. I love all of them. Even the prequels have some great stuff in there. My contract with Shannon obliges me not to defend the prequels too hard in a video attached to her name, but you know how I feel. You've read my emails. But come on. What were you doing? Did we really need Han to be marginally less of a scoundrel by making him shoot second? And then did we really need him to shoot second while also awkwardly CGI dodging a close-range laser blast? Did we really need R2 to be hidden slightly more behind the rocks, making it a little more believable that he couldn't be seen, but making us wonder how he even got in there? Did we really need to remove a cool scene from Return of the Jedi just to show off the amazing new CGI you could do now? Did we need this? This part looks better on VHS, by the way. I wonder if someone has done a video about why that would be. But come on, bro. Even you think the hand stuff is silly now. George, I loved your work, genuinely and completely. But it's on you that it's such a hassle to see the original unedited versions people saw and loved in the theatre, and that's just not fair, even if those versions don't line up with your vision. Spielberg did the right thing making sure the versions people loved are still available, because movies don't just belong to directors, to their supposed auteurs, they also belong to culture. You can have your version of the movie, but the people ought to have theirs. I genuinely find you and your work hugely inspirational, but the way access to the originals was deliberately obscured by you was really disappointing. All these different kinds of director's cut with differing resulting effects, well, they really complicate all this, don't they? So, yeah, studios mess with films, often irrevocably. It's nice that sometimes an unmessed version can manifest, but the problem is, artists and audiences have been enamored with the concept of this. Directors run the risk of falling down a rabbit hole, continuously re-editing their work once it's already out, like it's in early access or something, changing their minds about what their own visions even were, and sometimes even helping to obscure the versions people know and love from history. Worse than this, what makes a director an authority on what the film should be? Directors are a small part of a project. The producers, writers, editors, actors, artists, set designers, all these people are so important and valuable on any project that it seems almost rude to pretend the director is the one who should decide what the film they all made is. It takes a village to raise a child, and the mayor of the village shouldn't get to say that child belongs to them. This problem hits me on a personal level, in fact. The last Scanline video did surprisingly well, and made it into some lists of best video essays, but often it was credited directly to me, when Scanline is a collaborative show between me and Shannon Strucci, whose name was above mine in the credits. We share writing, editing, and other creative duties. She's editing this part right now, I'm just doing the voiceover. It's really nice that we got recognized for our work, but it's our work, not mine. I'm not trying to call anyone out here, but being credited for work that wasn't simply mine makes me a little uncomfortable. It's an easy mistake to make. The video is posted on my channel where most of the videos are purely my work, but I think this misunderstanding is also an extension of how we relate to art right now, as products of central individuals and not the many other people who work on something or the surrounding situation that led to it. On that note, I think what people like is the idea constructed by the concept of director's cuts. We like to imagine films as a struggle between true creators and the false money men, as a battle to realize someone's vision. It's a compelling narrative, and maybe it's a little true. The idea that there's an authentic version of a film is kind of beautiful, and that makes the struggle to try and get that version seem almost romantic. But this narrative has been repackaged and sold back to us in the form of special editions of Terminator 2 with a couple more scenes and box sets of every version of Blade Runner for us to compare and contrast. Think about that. Warner Brothers are responsible for the theatrical cut, and here they are, selling us the fixed version of a film that was broken by them. We like to think of works as made by one person, products of their own vision, when nothing is that simple. The Tears in Rain monologue, the best part of Blade Runner by far, wasn't made by Ridley Scott. It wasn't even written by the writer, not completely. Rutger Hauer modified the monologue the night before, making it shorter and feel more human, and added the most famous line.
And then, I came up with the line, all those moments will be lost in time like tears in rain.
Knowing this, the idea that it's all up to some sole creator and their mystical intent only obscures the reality of filmmaking and trains us to desire a purity of vision that's completely unattainable, makes us go out and buy more products for the joy of obtaining an even more perfected version of one person's idea, even if that idea was bad, and keeps changing even, necessitating more versions, and then unbroken versions so that you still have the original, and it just goes on and on forever. When does the consumption end and the art begin? There are no easy answers to questions about art. The best I can muster right now is, director's cuts are certainly a valid idea, and they can arguably improve the quality of a film, but this idea is also easily co-opted into the exact same commercialism that necessitated them in the first place. The idea that the director is the one person who should have final say on the most ideal version of a work is a highly ideological assumption which says more about how we think about film than it actually says about the medium itself. But that's a whole can of worms that we'll have to get into at a later date. I guess at some point we should maybe explore what authorship actually is, and whether the author is alive or not, and what the hell auteur means. Join us on the next Scanline when we discuss how meaning is constructed. Oh, great. I'm going to have to read books. But, if anything, what all this examination of cuts seems to relate is the power of editing. We've seen just how much very small changes can affect the feel of a whole sequence or the meaning of a story. An editor can make a bad film great, and a really good film terrible and boring. Editing is such an important part of the process that some people spend years of their lives or an awful lot of money learning how to do it. Too much money, frankly. Luckily, we here at Scanline have put together a functioning simulation of a film school.
Hi, Shannon here. This cut here, where the sound starts first, is a great technique for drawing people into your film. To do it, you just have the audio start first. See, it's under the video on the timeline, so it looks like a J. It's called a J cut. It's a J. That's how you do a J cut. Okay, thank you. That's film school. That'll be $15,000, please.
So yeah, director's cuts can be good. Often they aren't, Francis, but on the whole, it's clear why this is an aspect of film worth focusing on. Because as we've seen, films really can be greatly altered by even tiny removals or additions. Cinema is often as much in here as it is on the screen, But what we see on the screen with our eyes facilitates our emotions and beliefs and imaginations. Our collective reverence for alternative cuts reveals our understanding of the power films hold over us. By learning just how differently the same idea can be expressed, we're learning more about how to express ourselves. Cinema is a powerful thing because it is an extension of the human soul. I've seen things that you people would believe because you've seen them too. I've seen the addition of a daydream change how I feel about personhood and my entire understanding of a story. I've seen the addition of more things to something I like transform it into something I hate. And I've seen thousands of people criticize a few scant frames of digital puppeteering because the original meant so much to them. And I'm glad that none of these moments will ever truly be lost because we have the power to share them with each other. Thank you for watching.
And that's when I realized that this guy might like movies.
Hi there. This video is dedicated to the memory of Rutger Hauer, who passed away this year. Incidentally, 2019 is also the year in which Blade Runner was set. I find myself wondering which 2019 I'd rather live in, but frankly in both there are plenty of people who aren't being treated with the personhood they deserve. Go do something nice for someone today.